So there we go, Fabienne. You want to talk about it?
I know, I'm okay, thank you. So I was saying to Joe earlier on how much I love the fact that you've put me last, because there's so much of what I'm going to say that resonates with absolutely everything everyone has said, and that's possibly because my work has been really wide, and so I've seen a lot of those things. So I don't know whether I can obviously have my PowerPoint, that would be really cool. So I want to really talk about that magic and the gift when you suddenly have a free child. And not just for the child. And I probably would say the learning has been much bigger on my part than on my son's part, but we'll see to that. So, I don't know, is that working? If not, it doesn't matter. I just want to take you on a journey. And I'm going to take you on a journey over the last 8 years. So this is pretty much the confessions of a reformed mum and recovering teacher. I'll put that up front. So I'm sorry to say, shamelessly, I've only been a home educating mum for the last 18 months. I was a teacher through and through. And so I'll start from that, okay? And it's a journey. And the journey, I'm going to take you through 3 key moments, because they're really vital moments, I think. So pivotal moments. First one is 2014. So I returned to the University of Bristol after almost 10-year gap. And to say that I was horrified to what I came back to is an understatement. So in less than 10 years, the young people in front of me were clearly struggling and suffering. And sadly, I had to experience the worst thing that can ever happen when someone suffers from mental ill health. I don't really want to go there because that's not really the point of my talk, but this is the starting point. And that led me to doing my research on why are young people not flourishing, and publishing the first book, and then another book called How to Grow a Grown Up with a colleague who's a GP for parents, because I didn't want my children to arrive at university and be so unhappy. And then the second pivotal date was COVID. So I found myself, I used to be French language director at the university, so managing 1,000 students every year, 13 members of staff, and then COVID hit and we had to find a way to put everything online. And that was really tough. Whilst I have 2 boys, or we have 2 boys, who are now 16 and 13, but at the time had just entered secondary school, so year 7 and 8, and 5 and 6. And I became privy, as they were being homeschooled, and I'll insist on schooled because I was literally doing the schoolwork, to what was going on and the effect of that teaching on my children. So my youngest has now been diagnosed with dyslexia, and he was really struggling with the learning, and what I was seeing was he was being prepped for the SATs, right? So the SATs are the exams that they sit at the end of the primary school. It's not for the kids, it's for the schools, but obviously the children are not told that. And all I could see was literally him saying, I'm stupid, I don't get this. It would get into massive upset, and I would get upset. And then his brother, who's the opposite and academically stellar, was bored, but also struggling with things like project management and chunking things down and getting overwhelmed. So I thought, okay, that's really interesting. And so at that point, I started talking to loads of different people, thinking, surely we should be doing better. Because I went, what happens here in primary and secondary explains what I see at university. So that's when I started the podcast, The Flourishing Education. I'll show later, 193 conversations later. I'm still sort of discovering and shining the light on innovators and disruptors. And that's when I met the lovely Joanna and Matt at the back. And then the final date is 2021. And this squeezed lemon, that was me. after putting everything online, and then, going hybrid, so back at university, juggling the anxiety of students and staff. And I said to my boss, I want a year out. I don't know what I want to do, but I just want a year out. So I already had flourishing education because I'd written the books and I needed an outlet for the small royalties I was getting for the books. And so I thought, I'll take a year out. And on the first day of my sabbatical, my father-in-law passed away. He'd been poorly for 5 years. But on the first hour of my sabbatical, my husband was called, to be with his mum. And that, to me, knowing my father-in-law, was a bit of a wink, as he always said to me, you work too hard, Fabienne. So I took this year out, and in that year out, I started hanging out a lot more with Joanna and with a lot of home educators and talking to a lot of home educators and disruptors on the podcast. And then in January, my son, well, in fact, it was December, because obviously I'm French, you probably can hear from the name and the accent. We went back to France for Christmas. And our eldest said, I don't want to go back to school. I'm bored, and I loved learning at home. And I'll be honest, I kept fobbing him off. So I was like, yeah, great idea. I mean, I loved talking to disruptors, innovators in education. Not sure it's for me, though. But then what happens when your then 14-year-old looks at you and says, Mum, that thing you talk about, like flourishing? What happens when it's your son who's not flourishing? Okay. And we'd gone for a coffee with Joanna and her son, and our son Thomas came out and said to me, do you really, really think it's possible we can do something else? And at that point, I knew that I couldn't not take him out. So has it been easy as a reformed mum and a recovering teacher? No. It's been hell sometimes. And the first few months of deregistering him in January, or in fact I would say the first 3 weeks, I was probably rocking in the corner quite a lot and crying. But I think that's also part of the grieving process that a lot of us have to do, and I'll allude to that in a minute. So I want to talk first about the individual level, because I think it's really important. And I think a lot of you have, in all your talks, you've talked about the individual and the flourishing parent and child, etc. And so I would say probably, I knew that from my research. So flourishing has taken me in the field of ecology. So I'll share with you the metaphor I use for my research, but I talk about the garden called life. And I'd already realized that sadly the system says we're not, ecosystems, we're cogs in the machines. If we're honest, particularly here in the Western, educated, industrialized, democratic, science-based education, there's this whole idea of, it's all about Descartes and, Cartesian, black and white, reductionist, etc. And so I knew that we're not all identical, and yet if you look at the system, it funnels our kids, right, through these exams. And at uni, you can see how it goes. It's SATs that determines what GCSEs you take, because if you don't do well in your SATs, then you end up in bottom sets in secondary school, and then you get only a limited grade at your GCSEs. GCSEs, A-levels, hopefully, holy grail that university is. Preferably Oxford and Cambridge, and then after that Russell Group unis, and if you're really not lucky, then post-92, right? And so that really bothered me, and in my research, as I went on with the research, but also looking at my two children, so weirdly, as a reformed mum and a recovering teacher, I have two children who are, one in mainstream, his choice, I've tried to get him out, he doesn't want to. And one in being home educated. And so I think this is beautiful because they're showing me that they are unique and that in their uniqueness in this garden called life, it is my role as a mother. I mean, you were talking earlier on, Alison, about that space, holding that space, right? Beautiful space. So the image I love using for parents and for the people I talk to is, and mums who've been lucky enough to carry their children will really get this image. If you haven't, then I'm sorry, but hopefully it'll work. For me, is in fact, we kid ourselves as parents that we're in charge and we know what's going on and we have an impact on our children. The only thing we ever offer is the sacred space for that seedling to grow into the most beautiful and unique ecosystem that they were born to be. And, this is what Julia was alluding to, but many others, obviously, you were saying, Nicola, right, with your child. And we start as mums with, like, the sacred space of our womb. We never, ever decide when they grow their kidneys, their, fingers. We just provide the space and the resources for that to just unfold beautifully. And what would happen if we use that instead in education? What a difference would it make, right, in mainstream to the way we nurture our child? And I think what's not happening is this in education, is the fact that we're not allowing our children to develop this inner understanding of the inner, like Julia alluded to, but many others alluded to. Who am I in this garden called life, right? Because if you're a climbing ivy, then you need different surroundings and you've got different needs than if you're an orchid. One's not better than the other, it's just different. And that's so important because until you know who you are in this garden called life and you're rooted and you're like, this is me, and I'm not going to apologize, then you're going to be focused. If you are not, like you've not fully developed your understanding, you can't then be of service to others and of service of the wider planet because you're in survival. And in survival, you focus on me, myself, and I, and how do I cope with what's going on. So, and I think, hopefully, if you want to double check, you can ask Joanna, what's happened with our son Thomas in particular. He's discovering who he is, and he's so beautiful to watch. So the first meeting we had, Joanna and I, he sat down, he wouldn't look at the adult in the eye, he would look at me and then speak. That's not happening now. In fact, very often he goes, let me finish, is what I get instead. And interestingly, his brother, who is choosing to stay at school, stays at school not for the learning, but for his friendship that he has. He has 13 friends whom I met when he turned 13. I love them, they're great. I just want to rescue them. They're amazing, like really amazing, and they're so like him. But he doesn't care. So he goes in school, and because I'm like, it's fine if they give you like whatever they do. So in fact, for him, it's working for now. And that, who knows, maybe one day he'll want to be out of the schooling system. And the way in my research, what happened is I developed this flourishing model. And so this is what I've been using as a way of helping people, so this image of we are all ecosystems, and so depending on this ecosystem, then we have specific things and specific needs. The roots are like our values and our mindset and our past experiences. Then that determines our mindset and our life skills and learning skills. And then the 5 health, so cognitive health or mental health, social health, spiritual health, physical health and emotional health, And then the other three, and you're talking about curiosity, openness, those in my research showed up as what I call cultural agility. So because I worked with linguists who are used to working in different cultures, people who are culturally agile naturally are more curious and open and flexible. And all of those things that Julia was beautifully describing in her keynote. Obviously, clearly the research shows that people therefore flourish more. So I've given you a little bit about the individual and obviously my own understanding of self. The reason I call myself a reformed mum and a recovering teacher is because the learning has been far, 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 far more drastic for me. And the understanding and the understanding. It's been a long journey. So my research has also taken me away from the individual well-being to something that I think has been slowly destroyed in the UK, but everywhere, which is community. And I think I'm co-writing a second book or a third book with a colleague, and we're calling it Manifesto for Change. But I think that started roughly around Thatcher era, when she said there's no such thing as society, only individuals and families. And so I'm really interested in rebuilding communities and in shifting this sort of me focus to the we. And the way we do that, I'm not saying the me is not important, it's important, and I'll come back to that right at the end. But really, to move from the individual to the we, you shift the M, turn it on its head, and it becomes a W. So it's not that complicated, you know, and it starts with many of you, Alison said it, Julia said it, Nicola said it, slow down. So when I started my career break, the first thing I had to do is to hop off the hamster wheel. And I don't know if you've seen the hamster wheel going. When it stops, it doesn't just suddenly stop. There's still movement, right? So that's what's happened to me. It's like giving me time to slow down, but also giving our children time to slow down, right? Karen was saying that earlier on too, like just space, that space for breathing less, right? Less is more. And then, because I love the analogy of, I love nature, I find her my coach every day. And I love this analogy of what if we, the adults in the life of the children, from seedling all the way to grown ecosystem and plant, we were like gardeners. So that means that we look after the plant, and we look after the plant, and if they're not doing great, then we give them nutrients and we look after them. But it also means that there's several of us, and we might know one plant better than another. But certainly, like Alison said, we need to be experts at each plant and sort of getting to know what they need specifically. But that being an expert doesn't mean that we do everything for the plant. And the plant also has a responsibility. And by that I mean an ability to response, the ability to choose your response. And our children have that too. And so it's empowering them to, obviously decide, make decisions for themselves. Sometimes as a gardener, you need to do a little bit of pruning, right? And also when our children grow up, mine are teenagers now, so I think the container becomes bigger when they become teenagers, but the responsibility of that container and what they create within also becomes bigger. And that's really, I think, very important. So where the research is taking me is toward community well-being. And this work is the work of somebody called Bacon-Hall. So this is what we know fosters well-being in individuals. Again, this is really well validated. So the autonomous motivation, intrinsic motivation, central, and then a sense of belonging, positive relationships, autonomy or agency, and then you call competence, which is obviously also the what others may call as skills, right? So those are the elements. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and my research into schools. I'm sorry, I don't like mainstream. I just think that, as home educators, we have to pay for so much. And I just think, why can't we have a system that actually fosters so we don't have, and nurtures our children that way, so we can all be part of the system and we don't have to pay. That's why I care deeply. And so I'm going to take that and do a PhD. And I've just been given funding for 4 years to do just that. So that's quite exciting, and I'm starting in September. And then obviously I'm also going to take that into the learning hub that Joanna and another lady, Caroline, and obviously with Matt, we are going to grow. We're going to sort of develop a learning hub for teenagers in Bristol and take the research and embed it. But before we can have community, really the last few things I want to mention before I open the floor, and I just would love us to have an exchange and like our key takeaways before we get to Juliet's sort of final words, is that you can't have a flourishing community if you don't have a flourishing individual. And so I really, really believe that what has been said previously is that if I don't have a flourishing I, then if I'm stressed out, so in my research, literally, if you have a stressed out adult or a stressed out child, then you will automatically have an influence on one another. And the research is so scary that, like, if you look at lab rats, so there's loads of research papers that show that if you take a lab rat, stress it, and then put it with its partner that's never experienced stress, the other lab rat will change its brain structure to adapt to its stressed out partner. If that doesn't give you goosebumps, as in like, oh my God, then for me it was so shocking, okay? So my message, if nothing else that you take away, you care, you need to take care of yourself. And, now it's become a little bit cliche metaphor, oxygen mask on, you're going to pour from an empty cup, blah, 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 yeah, I know. It truly is that vital and important. Really, truly is. Because we can't have flourishing young people if we parents, like I was, running around like on our hamster wheel. My work, I cringe now when I think about it, but when I worked full time with the two boys, the word I used the most was like, come on! How awful. Like 7 o'clock in the morning, come on! So, yes. And the other thing I haven't said, which is also links to the uniqueness, what works for you may not work for someone else. So I've got a really good friend. She thinks that the funnest, like best way to exercise physical activity is ultramarathon. No thanks. That would definitely put me under a lot of stress. So, and for our young people who are so exposed to media, like social media and the highlight reels, but also for us, it's so, like you were saying, Juliet, right? You just, and also Juliet, the seeing others doing all these amazing, like all those amazing home ed parents who are doing all these crafty things and, do what works for you, right? Mine is just taking the dog out for a long walk in nature. Like, if you know what works for you, that's really important. And the next thing is, and it links to what Karen was saying just in her presentation, I don't know if you went there, the work of Kirsten Neff on being kind to ourselves, so self-compassion. And I really love her work because what she talks about is this sort of self-kindness. So how often we are not so kind to ourselves, but really kind to others, right? So giving ourselves the same kindness that we would give to our best friend, right? The way we talk to ourselves in that inner dialogue, sometimes I'm not sure we would say those things to our children or our loved ones. So challenging that. And then that I really resonate with. We're all human beings. And so we all suffer and we all experience pain. And so connecting back to that the connectedness with the others. And then the mindfulness. So, not exaggerating it, but not also minimizing it and brushing it under the carpet, which is sometimes what we have to do, or we do. So I talked to you briefly about what I've been doing. So the podcast, I said, that's like 193 conversations and counting. That's my way of growing and developing and constantly de-schooling myself. I realize there's so much I've been so over-schooled. Gosh. So if you want to go and check that out, that's really cool. I thought I would also give you a visual of the two books. But then the next thing, before I open up to questions and a conversations, because I would really love us to have a conversations, comments, feedback, is just get in touch and let's learn together. So I think that, and then again, I think Alison was talking about how much she learned with and through her children. I truly believe, so I don't know if you know them, if you don't, check them out. They're called Dr. Eagleman and Dr. Siegel. Dr. Siegel talks about being not interconnected, but intra-connected. And I love his work because it's very much this, I am learning today as much being with and through you and all of those things. And this is so true of any interaction. So every dialogue, every conversation we have literally leads to us learning and growing and developing. Because for me, education, people sort of say, we need to change the word education, it doesn't work, I disagree. Education is literally lifelong, life-wide, life-deep learning. It starts when we created, and it ends when we die. And so why would we not nurture that? And that will look so different depending on who we are. So get in touch, and the way you do that are my details. And then I'll just open the floor for any comments, questions, linking back to the presentations, because I think that's also how we connect the dots and grow and develop. Any challenges? I love challenges because I think that's also how we grow and develop. So I'll leave it there. Just want to thank you.
So does anyone have questions for Fabienne? Or comment or anything?
Do you have any advice for a working homeschooling mum?
Sorry?
Advice for a working homeschooling mum?
Be kind to yourself. How? Just do what you can, one day at a time, 1 minute at a time, we're not super mums, right? So I would say, cut yourself some slack. The fact that you're home educated, you've made that decision and you're working, wow, power to you. Because I couldn't do it, so amazing. I also think you're touching on a topic that obviously, given the space, the space and the time we had today, I haven't spoken about, and it's also something I care really deeply about. The system we live in and the capitalist society we live in is that, sadly, the current currency we use for exchange of service is money. And so we all need money to put food on the table and to pay the bills. And God knows that the last sort of 12 months, the bills have really increased. So I think there's also that, being able to, home educating really is a cost, a financial cost, but also, there are other implications. So I would go back to the slide about self-compassion and just be kind to yourself. The fact that you're giving your children the gift of being free from a coercive, I'd almost venture as far as abusive system. Well done.
And I just want to add to that, I think it depends a lot on what your circumstances are specifically, like the ages of your children, what sort of job you're in, whether you have a partner or a spouse that is working as well, and how, so there's a lot of factors. And you're working from home, yeah? And how old are your children? Yeah, so they're still quite high, needing quite dependent a lot. I home educated 7 children over 25 years, and in my experience, the primary years should be focused on play, and then maybe more play. And if they love books, encourage them to read, because things will snap into place when they get a little older. So if you do a lot of play-based and allow them to play and not feel guilty about them playing. If you do feel you have to tick a box, I used to say to my kids, I want you to do so many pages of maths, so many pages of English a day, and it took them under an hour, and then the day was theirs, and they did their maths and English, and it's like, brownie points to me. So, it really just depends on your circumstances, and if they, if you kind of want to encourage them to be as independent as possible, so they don't need you quite so much, but when they're younger, obviously they do. And it's that juggling game. But I would say probably the best advice is to go and talk to other parents who are doing it and have done it, and get support from those who have found ways already, just from a very practical point of view. And there are just some amazing people out there that are juggling it somehow. It's an incredible thing you're doing.
Find a Joe.
Yeah.
Find a Joe. There's loads of Joes.
It's Wave Joe.
Well, maybe not if you're not in Bristol, then maybe
but
not Joe.
Find somebody that you can relate to, that you can. There's a lady by the name of Alberta Stevens, Homegrown Sunshine, spelled with an S-O-N, and I know she's a working mum and a single mum. So you might want to go and look her up. Just those are the people you need to talk to, the ones who are making it work. But that's on a very practical note. One of the things, now Fabienne, I did step out the room for a minute, but I've done sort of webinars with Fabienne, and she's the one thing that you used, and I know it's not your phrase, but it is a lovely way of looking at the change between being a teacher and a home educating parent, is that she said, she was, you go from being the sage on the stage, the one who's meant to know it all, to being the guide on the side. And it is something. The terminology we can't take credit for it, but it actually is really a good way to think of it. That shift, so you don't have to know everything.
And it's not easy to move to guide on the side.
No, I think it's a control thing, isn't it? Maybe a bit, and fear. I think fear is a big part of it. Yeah. Anyone else have a question or a comment?
I'm really pleased that you mentioned kind of the grieving process, because I think that's not often talked about. So thank you for mentioning that. The whole deschooling process, just my question is, what surprised you about it? Or what came up for you in that? Because again, it's not talked about.
No, so I think the grieving process is the biggest and the most important one in that unschooling, the whole unschooling. What surprised me the most is, gosh, how many times am I going to cry? I cry all the time. And allowing that, I think we're not, as nations, we're not always great with emotions that are sometimes not not the norm. So when I feel sad, I cry. Because I am grieving, I'll be honest. I was a teacher through and through. I believe very strongly in the power of education. I do, but not education as in you've got to get this degree and at the cost of your well-being. That's not what I signed up for. So yes, I'm grieving because that's not what I thought we're signing up for. And it's hard because so many times I've tried to step away. I still wish I could step away and do a job and then go home and forget it. And, why do I, I'm sure my husband would love it if I stepped away. Bless him, he's been like taken with the stream of it all. But I can't. And I think what I keep going back to is how deep the schooling and the overschooling is. And I would argue that all of us adults all need that process of being deschooled. So I was talking, one of the biggest thing that for me keeps coming back up, and I'm like, I thought we'd looked at that. Obviously, clearly not. But the system, it fosters, so in my research I can see that young people develop competitiveness, fear of failure, imposter syndrome, comparatitis, right? Those are the 4 things that come up in my research. And if we're honest, if we truly look at ourselves in the mirror and are honest with ourselves, when we are triggered in our survival, this is the default mode. So one of the biggest things in those 193 conversations I've seen is that there's so many amazing people doing amazing things, but it's not connected. So there's not enough of us coming together to pool resources and work together. And the reason for that is probably Campbell's fault with his hero's journey, is that there's a part of us, if we are honest, and I can say that because I see it in others, because it's in me. I'm not pretending by any way or measure that I'm any better than anyone. When I'm triggered, I will go in fight, flight, freeze, and I will be worried about other people, particularly if they're doing something similar to what I'm doing. I'll be triggered. But until we really consciously become aware of that, share and open those spaces. Alison, I loved your image, Alison, because I use it, that dance, right? That delicate dance where one takes a step and the other one sort of... Until we do that, my big dream is through the podcast and the work I do, because I love shining the light on innovators and disruptors, is imagine, I don't know if you've seen the pictures of Earth at night when it's lit up and you see it from the sky. Imagine if we all we find a way of having a map on the internet where all those amazing lights, people like Julia and Alison and Nicola, and you can zoom on that light, and you were talking about how do I do it? Connect to other lights, because 2 lights is stronger than 1 light, is brighter. Imagine if we could create that. Then I think, that root grass movement, the government hasn't got a chance. Ofsted, the government, the Department for Education, because they won't have votes. So they'll start listening to us. So sorry, I've given you a really long ranty sort of, I'm French, I can't help it.
Thanks, Fabienne. But I think that is important also, is that one of the things that I'd really like to come out of this conference is it's just that people become more aware of how the system is not serving our children. It is not doing the job it's set out to do. It is not preparing children for the life that they're going to lead. And I say that as somebody who was very happy in school. It worked for me. And I think what we're finding today, I could just get on a whole hobby horse just about the education system, and I do think some things are very specific to this country that are very harmful. because the agenda is shaped around, not around the children, but around the economy and around politics, and it's not about the child. And I love to talk about Joy Baker, who was a pioneer in this country in the 50s, who chose to not send her children to school. And she got into quite a fight with the local authorities. And they said, oh, but you know, your children will be much better if this is a good school. And what is it? And then she said, so what you're saying, so once they're in that school, you're not bothered about what they do. And they said, well, no, they just need to be in the school. She said, so actually, if they're sitting there doing nothing, you're fine with it as long as they're physically in that building. And this is what we have the problem with at the moment, is that there are a lot of children who are physically in a building, and there are people that are not really worrying about what they're doing. And just because a child is sitting at a desk with a book in front of them and looks to all intents and purposes like he's learning, does not mean that there's anything going on up there at all. And so we have to reshape the narrative around what learning is and how it happens, because that's actually to get people to understand that. You hear it come out like with the pandemic schooling, and children are sitting, my little grandson sitting there staring at a screen for a couple of hours a day, and you say to him, he comes out and you say, so what were they talking about? Oh, I don't know. And it's like, yes, he looked like he's learning, but what did he gain? Gained nothing. And I think that's the conversation we need to be having, and we need to be challenging that idea of what learning is, because we're just missing the mark so hugely in this country, and we're letting these kids down, and it's a very big problem.
And that you touch on to something that we also haven't spoken about, but links to the working from home and having the children. The truth is, the reason I sent my children to school is because I needed them to be at school to be able to work.
And
that's the truth. And so if there'd been another approach, or if I could have done my job whilst homeschooling or whatever, which is what happened with COVID, then I would have, but I couldn't, or I chose not to, because also the lie I was sold is get on the hamster wheel, get the degree or get the qualifications, get the degree, buy the first house or house, all of those things. And that is also part of the conversation of the deschooling and schooling, approach, which is, I earn now nothing almost, but you know what, I'm so much happier. So.
And I think a society that isn't, when my personal belief is that a lot of what we see in terms of bullying in schools and cruelty between children is actually coping mechanisms that children have learned to cope with playground politics, because they were torn away from their mums way too young before they were emotionally secure. So that's a whole other subject. So we can go on and on. So anyway, I think we're going to end it off there, because a quick one, Sandrine. I know what you like.
It might not be. You might have to answer me after, but I'm interested because I'm actually French as well. So I'm interested in what has been the reaction of your French family and friends to you choosing to home educate, because it's a particular culture.
So I'll give it to you in French. Okay, literally, and interestingly, probably the response. I found out afterwards, my dad, so I am working class, back home in France, and my dad has always told me the way out of being working class is you work hard and you make your way. So like a good little girl, that's what I did. And so suddenly, I take, of all the children, like my two children, if you'd ask me, who would you ever, if you ever deregistered, which one would it be? I would have said the one who's dyslexic, not the one who's academically stellar. Tom is literally shaped in a way that he fits the box. He is the 1/3 that would get all the, he is that gifted, talented, all of those things. So when I said, we've just deregistered Tom, and my dad said nothing, so I knew we were in trouble, because normally he's a bit like me, he's vocal, so he said nothing. And he always goes through my mum to get a message to me. So, and the first few months were tough. So I cried a lot. And then I think my dad then said, I remember at one point I said, I'm really concerned that what I've done is horrendous. Like, what have I done? And at that point he said, yeah, well, I agree. Okay, but now he loves it. He loves it. And, you know, Tom's going to turn 16, so then like saying, hey, do you want to come over? And like, you can fly without mum now. So I think they're being on, I think the ripple effect of that, when you're in school, I was talking about my husband, I think everybody is having ripple effects, like because you change, then automatically, like that energy, then automatically changes. And then the thing is, who cares? You know, the French thing is a completely different subject because you're not allowed to unschool your child or to deregister your child and so on. Well, yeah, it's like, Descartes, that's where it comes from. Yeah.
And I think you're always going to be challenged by even if you're not French, you can get families here that will, like I've heard of some people where the family members said to them, you know, you're too thick to educate your own child. Honestly, you're too thick. They've said, like, to their own daughter or whatever, you know, how are you going to do it? You know, it is, and all you can hope to do. I mean, I used to, my early home educating days, 25 years ago, was, please let it pay off, because you know that people are watching you. And actually my father, who was he wasn't so sure in the beginning, he ultimately became quite a proponent and a promoter of home education, stood up in front of a group of home educators like this and told everyone what a wonderful job they were doing. Mm-hmm. So you can win them over. Jean, you might have gone through something similar. I don't know. We'll hear your story. But yeah, so we're going to have to wrap it up now because we've got on a schedule to get out, you know, cleaned up and everything. So we're not leaving yet. You stay where you are. Thank you, Fabienne.